Thanks again. I'm so glad to have followed that previous session because I think it lays the groundwork much better than I could have as to the challenges of reimbursement, and I think it'll set the stage for what I'm about to say next and make it a little bit more easy to understand. So take a step back. When people hear the word FDA, a lot of thoughts come to mind. One can be that it's very confusing. I mean, it's this giant organization, as was just mentioned, trying to get access into that organization or figuring out where to access the organization can be very difficult and confusing. It can be frightening. We make some significant decisions on devices and that have significant implications on manufacturers and other stakeholders. And often people, when they hear the word FDA, might think obstacle. And that's probably because there's a regulatory requirement for getting new devices onto the market. And I think, under Jeff Shuren over the past several years, I think that the Center for Devices has really tried to improve the center from being less frightening, less confusing, and less of an obstacle while still meeting our regulatory evidentiary requirements through things like focusing on customer service. And really what it boils down to is increased availability and interactions between sponsors, which we call sponsors or manufacturers, and the FDA. It's interesting that when we go out and speak with people in either think tanks or incubators or at manufacturers, we start to hear things like winning coverage and payment has become a steeper challenge than gaining FDA approval for small device firms in recent years. So reimbursement has actually become perhaps the missing puzzle piece for getting a device to the market and increasing or providing widespread access of that device to the public and to the patients that need them. And the challenge from our perspective is we typically work in silos. There's the regulatory silo, and we go and we attack that silo, and then we move to the clinical silo to kind of address the regulatory silo, and then we think about reimbursement separately in a silo, and later down the line even further is marketing and sales. And the challenge is, as you heard just previously, is that regulatory agencies like the FDA and CMS and reimbursement agencies like CMS, we have different levels of evidence we have to meet, and therefore we speak different languages. But the goal is to maybe not get us to speak the same exact language, but at least to understand the perspective that each of us is coming from. I love the fact that the regulatory language is this complete disorganized mess of squiggly lines, but these aren't my slides actually, so I think it's appropriate. Our commissioner, Scott Gottlieb, last month made a point of stating how important it is that advancing the public health means helping to make sure patients have access to safe, effective medical products. And so it's very clear, it's becoming increasingly clear, that FDA approval or clearance does not necessarily equate to patient access, and that obtaining reimbursement is a significant obstacle, especially for innovative and small device firms. And the FDA is in a unique position to try to improve access to approved or cleared devices in the absence of adequate coverage. So the FDA actually recognizes the importance of working collaboratively with the payer community to streamline the path from FDA market authorization to payer coverage and reimbursement. Why is the FDA in somewhat of a unique position? Because we do have well-structured formats for interacting and having dialogue with manufacturers and various other stakeholders through the pre-submission process and other processes. And we interact with device manufacturers very often very early in the evolution of their device. Several years ago, the Payer Communications Task Force was formed at the FDA. The mission is to facilitate earlier communication between device manufacturers and payers, to shorten the time between approval or FDA regulatory decisions and coverage decisions. With the goal is to develop these are voluntary processes, not required from the FDA's perspective, that facilitate earlier interactions with payers about evidence to support coverage and reimbursement. I'm not talking about parallel review here. That's something that was brought up a little bit earlier, and I'm so very happy that a point was made that a national coverage determination, which is what parallel review is, whereby the FDA reviews a device from a regulatory perspective and CMS reviews the device at sort of the same time in parallel, but for a national coverage determination. And there are risks to getting a negative national coverage determination. And that may that may be the reason why this is not as popular a program or as utilized a program as some might think. It sounds like it's a no-brainer. Get them both reviewed at the same time, cut the time to getting both regulatory approval and reimbursement. There's some downsides, apparently, from the reimbursement perspective. The bar can be somewhat high to get a national coverage determination, and if you get a negative determination, as we heard, that can be difficult to bounce back from. This is something different that we're talking about today. What are we actually encouraging? Well, as I said, the FDA review team and the manufacturers, there's infrastructure to set up meetings and have ongoing dialogues throughout the entire process from very beginning to very end. We're encouraging to bring the payers into this discussion, to provide a process to enable manufacturers to include engage payers during meetings with the FDA using our pre-submission process. This is not a new process. This is something that's been standing for a long period of time, so it's well organized. There's a very set process for engaging the FDA through the pre-submission process. So currently, regulatory and reimbursement happens in series. Regulatory first, then start thinking about reimbursement. And this created a gap between the regulatory approval and reimbursement. And in that gap was lack of patient access. And the mission of the FDA is to protect and also promote the public health. And that promotion part involves getting public access to devices and drugs and biologics to U.S. patients as soon as possible. What we're trying to shift towards is a parallel process where regulatory and reimbursement decisions can happen in parallel rather than in series to kind of shorten that gap between the regulatory decision and the reimbursement decision. I'm not going to go into great detail. This is the pre-submission process, which you've heard about. There's a guidance. This is the guidance. It was published 4 years ago. This is the FDA's current thinking on the availability and the process for engaging in the pre-submission process. Classically, sponsors come to us before their clinical trial or their IDE application to discuss the clinical trial. Again, this is a sort of a low-risk opportunity. It's an opportunity for sponsors to come to the FDA, present information to the FDA, and have the FDA weigh in on specific questions about that information. We don't review data during this process, but importantly, we don't make any negative or positive decisions with regard to the device at this point. So it's really low-pressure opportunities for a question and answer process. Pre-submissions are also obtained after the clinical data are completed or collected and before the marketing application to make sure that the FDA and the sponsor are on the same page before moving forward with that application. So these are the opportunities, the pre-submission opportunities to also involve payers, and you can see how early that this can occur. It's even before the clinical trial is put into effect. What's the FDA not doing? Well, we're not becoming coverage or reimbursement experts. We're not promoting specific devices, manufacturers, or payers. We're not considering reimbursement or cost for our approvals. We never have. We don't have the regulatory authority to do so, and we're not changing that at this time. We're not modifying our review or decision processes. We're not sharing documents or information, and we're not suggesting that payers use the FDA's requirements or alter their own standards. Now, the current participating organizations in what I would call this early payer engagement opportunity are listed here. And you'll notice that it does not include CMS at this time. These are all private payers at this point. But there is probably significant value in getting payer input early in the process of the lifespan of a medical device. What's the goal? So the goal is to get that clinical data that's collected by the sponsor to support their regulatory evidentiary requirements to form multiple purposes, to serve multiple purposes, not just to form apple juice, for example, but maybe cran apple and cran apple raspberry or whatever else, to get that clinical data to not only serve the regulatory requirement, perhaps some aspects of the reimbursement requirement as well. How does the program actually work? So the sponsor, again, this is voluntary. The sponsor identifies that or expresses an interest in the program, and they will contact the Payer Communication Task Force at the FDA, and there are ways of doing that, and I'll put that up at the end of the presentation. They provide a summary of the relevant information that they want to be reviewed, and the payers then will, once they're identified, will then kind of make a decision as to whether they can participate or not, and that's up to the payer. The PCTF, the task force, kind of acts as the go-between between the payer and the sponsor. There's some administrative preparation work before the meeting. Those of you who have been at a pre-submission meeting at the FDA know how it works. You come to the FDA, we sit across the table, you present your information, we discuss the questions you provided. This is an opportunity to now bring in a payer to listen to that conversation and to have some input into what's being discussed. At the end, we collect, the sponsor provides meeting minutes, we agree on those meeting minutes, and then everybody kind of regroups and decides where to go from there. So at its most basic, this is an opportunity to bring payers in at a very early part of the discussion about clinical trials and the market application process from the FDA. Why not contact private payers directly? We heard just previously that that's a good thing to do, and we definitely agree. You should contact payers directly. Are there any benefits to working with the FDA through this early payer engagement? Yeah, there are. Number one, if you're not familiar on how to contact payers, you don't have an in, well, the communication task force will do that for you. They'll act as that go-between between the sponsor and the payer. And again, the FDA has a very solid structure for interactions between sponsors and the agency to create that ongoing dialogue. Again, pre-submissions can be about anything you want them to be. They can be about your clinical trial, they can be about, we talked about training, they can be about labeling, they can be about anything. So bringing payers in, especially when you're considering your clinical trial, can be valuable. For example, the FDA may say, you don't need X, Y, or Z in your clinical trial. And the payer may chime in and say, okay, but if you're thinking down the road about getting a reimbursement decision, you might want to start collecting these data, cost analysis data, during your clinical trial. That's not apparent to the FDA. We're not going to give you the feedback that you need to get cost analysis data during your clinical trial because that's not on our evidentiary radar. And so involving the payers at this stage can be quite valuable. These are some reference links that are provided to the Payer Communication Task Force, the current coverage organizations that are interested in providing that input, our pre-submission program, and some contact information for the Payer Communication Task Force. It's just CDRH, or Center for Devices and Radiological Health, Payer Communications at fda.hhs.gov. So thanks.
Two comments, or a comment and a question. The comment is that I do encourage people to interact with the FDA up front or even during the process, as was mentioned with focused ultrasound for prostate, which were followed by PMA passed by a couple of vendors. We were not successful. We sat down with the FDA to explore an alternative path. They weren't comfortable with that alternative path, but came back to us with a possible creative solution, which led ultimately to the de novo authorization that we have. So I think it really, truly has become an interactive process, especially in the urology division. My question is, the sentiment has come up repeatedly over the past couple of days, which is, and it was mentioned on one of the panels, which is that it's a loop that doesn't make sense. That is that the payers want data, but you can't get data until you can treat patients, and you can't treat patients until it's covered. The FDA you've indicated that one of your goals, and we saw this when we worked with you, is to get innovative technology into the hands of clinicians so that patients can be treated. While the FDA may not be involved in the reimbursement process, the concept of saying, we, the FDA, need ongoing data to support these registrations. We encourage you, the payers, to come up with a program that proactively pays during some period of time, which will allow us to accumulate the data that can be submitted so that you can make your ongoing decisions, that perhaps that's sort of an end around to allowing the FDA to help encourage earlier coverage of these things, at least on a tentative basis.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. I think there is that sort of circle that gets formed whereby CMS wants more data, but the device is cleared to the market or approved or granted to the market, but there's no coverage determination on them, and therefore there's no reimbursement. And some of these devices and treatments can be very costly, and therefore patients are paying out of pocket. So how rapidly are you actually going to be accumulating that information into a registry that then is being used to generate coverage data? I think what you're asking or saying is encouraging the FDA to become more active in working with CMS to coordinate not only from our perspective the data that are needed, but also the coverage that's provided at the time of these studies. And I think the challenge is there. I think it's a great idea. Something has to be done to encourage the collection of these data. And if reimbursement is an issue, as the commissioner, I mean, that was the commissioner's blog from September 8th, and he realizes the concerns about patient access is hampered by reimbursement issues. I think the challenge is we have to resolve some of the evidentiary differences that we have and the things that we're looking for insofar as what we need for both reimbursement and regulatory decisions. The other question is, I think what's challenging is I don't know how much weight what the FDA says would carry with CMS. I just wonder what they're going to say, whether the FDA comes up and says you guys should really start paying for or paying more for these cleared devices. That would require, I think, a bit more of an understanding between the FDA and CMS than currently exists. But doesn't mean that it can't be pursued.
I certainly can't speak for the Focused Ultrasound Foundation, but from what's been shared with us over the past several days and in separate meetings, I think that one way to help that process is to use the Focused Ultrasound Foundation and its advocates to help maybe figure out how to make that process work, to engage multiple parties in that discussion proactively in order to see whether a game plan can be established, because it affects everybody in this room. We've all, in our own disciplines, experienced exactly the same issue.
And the Payor Communication Task Force is not urology specific or device specific. So that's sort of one way in. That's sort of the liaison sort of from the FDA to CMS that exists. And I don't know if there's value to discussing these kinds of proposals with the PCTF and see if because they have access to some of the payers. I don't know what their interaction with CMS is, but that might be the area. Remember, my slide was that the FDA can be very confusing. Like, where do you access the FDA to approach this question? And what I'm possibly proposing, I hope nobody from the PCTF comes and beats me up, but maybe that's the area where we can discuss this kind of shared value proposition. Thank you.